leaving, otherwise we would have to enlarge the room. Well, I'm sorry, this is the last time I'll be with you. I won't be able to be here in the afternoon. My wife is sick and I can't let her leave, can't leave her alone all day. So I said I'll be home after lunch to take care of her. This is a topic that I have not chosen. It was requested from me to speak on this topic because of a book that has been published by the Review. And I will deal with the book first and then explain how I see, or how most of the Adventists see, Daniel 11. The last division in the book of Daniel is the most detailed prophecy of future events in the Old Testament. The topic this morning is somewhat different from the last 2 days, and because of its sensitive nature, I will stick closely to my manuscript more than I have done in the past few days. So because it contains the most detailed prophecy in the Old Testament, it's also the most difficult to understand properly. We do well to remember that the great prophecies of Daniel, I better switch this on. The great prophecies of Daniel are given in accordance with the principle of repetition and enlargement. You can see here that these prophecies in Daniel 2, 7, 8, and 11 begin either in the time of Babylon or in the time of Medo-Persia. And all of them go to the end of time, to the second advent, which we hope all to experience someday. Amen. Daniel 2, 7, and 8 all deal with the same powers. Chapter 7 enlarges the outline of Daniel 2. Daniel 2 gives us an overview of the political situation in the world from Babylon to the end of time. Daniel 7 enlarges this by adding the little horn power. But otherwise you have the same powers: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, divided Europe. But here in Daniel 2 you don't have the papacy. But in Daniel 7 this aspect is added to the prophecy. It enlarges the prophecy of Daniel 2. And Daniel 8 enlarges the outline of Daniel 7 by emphasizing even more the activity of the little horn, but from a different perspective. In Daniel 7, the little horn is seen as a political power uprooting other powers. You remember 3 horns are taken out. Whereas in Daniel 8, the focus is on the religious activity of the little horn. So in Daniel 7, we have the political activity. In Daniel 8, the religious activity. And it is important to remember that with Daniel 8:14, where it says the 2,300 days, with this text, Daniel 8:14, the symbolic visions finish. And from then on, we have explanation. In Daniel 9, for example, we are given the explanation of the times when they begin. The time prophecies begin in 457 BC, down here. And then in Daniel 11, it further enlarges on Daniel 8. So if Daniel 7 enlarges Daniel 2, and Daniel 8 enlarges on Daniel 7, we can expect that the visions of Daniel 10 to 12 will enlarge the outline of Daniel 8, because it follows in sequence. You see, first Daniel 2, political overview. Daniel 7, the same as here, but it includes the little horn activities, political activities of little horn. Daniel 8 again enlarges on Daniel 7 by showing the religious activity of the little horn. And so Daniel 10 to 12, we would expect continue this trend and explain further what happened in the previous visions, enlarges what happens in these. Now this has been by and large the Adventist understanding of the prophecies in Daniel, including Daniel 11. In recent years, however, some Adventist interpreters have begun to interpret Daniel along different lines. Looking at the situation in the world today, particularly about the undeclared war between radical Islam and the West, some interpreters have started to include Islam in Daniel 11. This view has become quite well known among Adventists in North America because of the book Islam and Christianity in Prophecy by Tim Rosenberg. Now Tim and I have spent a few hours together on two different occasions. He came to my office once, and then at a ministers' meeting we spent time together discussing his views. We agreed to differ, but we parted as friends. And I hope we can do the same this morning, even if you disagree with me, that we're still friends. Rosenberg's basic outline of prophecy is given in his book on page 203 to 212. He begins, as we all do, with Medo-Persia in verse 2. Then in verse 3 and 4 we have Greece. That is clear, everybody agrees on this. Then we have, he has 5 to 19, the wars between the Seleucids, that's the king of the north, and the Ptolemies, the king of the south, Ptolemies in Egypt, and the Seleucids in Syria and in the east. Then he has in verse 20 to 22 the Romans, 23, 24 the rise of the papacy, and then from 25 to 28 he has the Crusades. And for him this is the first conflict between Christianity and Islam, the Crusades. Then 29 to 39 he has the second conflict between Christianity and Islam during the time of the Reformation. And the third conflict, he believes, is to a future in verses 40 to 45. That is his outline as he has given it in his book. Now this outline presents some problems which I will now mention. Straight away you can see that this outline does not really go back to this here. In other words, it does not further explain Daniel 8 with the papacy, but it focuses on a different power, and that power is now Islam. So here this progression is somehow changed. Now let's go back to our outline here. On page 12 in his book, Rosenberg states, I believe that the prophecies of Daniel predict 3 holy wars between Islam and Western Christianity. Unfortunately, he finds no room for the Islamic conquest before the Crusades. That is, the most important war between Christianity and Islam was in the 6th and 7th century, when Islam conquered Christianity in North America and in the Middle East. We must remember that Christianity was primarily, in the first few centuries, primarily in the East, in what we call the Middle East today, and North Africa. The most famous church father, Augustine, in the 5th century, he came from North Africa. The Council of Nicaea in 325 had 118 bishops assembling for this council, which Constantine the emperor called. More than 100, I think it was 108, came from the east, and only a few came from the west, from Rome, and from the western part of Christianity. So the center of Christianity in the first few centuries was in the east, not in Rome, not in the west. But Islam came, the Muslims came and wiped out Christianity in the Middle East and in North Africa. And yet this conflict between the two powers does have no room in his outline, which I find a bit strange. If Daniel 11 deals with a conflict between Christianity and Islam, well, yeah, he has here this outline, the rise of the papacy and then the Crusades. And on page 31, he calls the Crusades the first conflict between the papacy and Islam. But the real conflict at the beginning, the first great conflict between the two powers, was in the 7th and 8th century and went on until about 1000, where you can see Islam from Saudi Arabia, where it began. It conquered all of North Africa, even part of Spain, and then extended the Middle East and far to the east. And that does not appear in his outline. He has no room for that. Now, I talked with him about this, and in response he said, Daniel was selective in what he included. It is our job to figure out what he's saying and why. This does not give us permission to add information from history that is not in the prophetic text. I start with the Crusades because this is what I see in the text. And that is exactly the point. It is what he sees in the text. It's not what the text gives him, not exegetically compelling. It's what he sees in the text. If Daniel 8 describes the war between, or the wars in plural, between Islam and Christianity, why would God omit the most important war? The war that wiped out a large part of Christianity. Now, Adventist interpreters have had trouble with Daniel 11. Within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Daniel 11 has received a variety of interpretations. The differences between the various authors concern primarily the question, at what point in the story do the Romans and the papacy enter the picture? Daniel, F.D. Nichol, who wrote the Adventist Bible Commentary, or he was the editor, other people wrote different books. But in the book by Nichol, that is in the Adventist Bible Commentary, and Mervyn Maxwell, see the Roman enter, or the Roman entry in verse 14. Roy Allen Anderson and George McCready Price and W.H. Shea believe the Romans come on the scene in verse 16. Jacques Ducamp, who teaches at Andrews University, he believes that the Romans appear briefly only in verse 4. From verse 5 on, he has the papacy as the king of the north until the end of the chapter. Maxwell applies verses 21 to 45 to the papacy. Shea has the papacy enter the story in verse 23. Price in verse 30. And Nichol and Anderson believe that not until verse 31 can we discern the activities of the papacy. You can see that there is a large variety of interpretations within the Adventist Church concerning Daniel 11. Now, Rosenberg differs from all of them. He has Rome appearing in verse 20, the papacy in verse 23, and Islam in verse 25, which he then carries on until the end. Rosenberg claims that the prophecies in Daniel are historically sequential. That is, nation or events follow each other chronologically. He says the entire prophecy that includes predictions of the three major conflicts between Christianity and Islam appear in Daniel 11, 2 to 12, 3. It starts in the time of Daniel, that's the 7th century BC, moves in a straightforward way through human history, and concludes with the end of the world. So here he says it goes straight line from Daniel's time until the end of history. By the way, it doesn't appear in the 7th. It doesn't start in the 7th century because the Medo-Persians were in the 6th century, but that's just a historical item. The explanation that the prophecy moves chronologically through history, I agree with that, but when it comes to the text, he doesn't do it. And I show you what happens. He has the Crusades in verses 25 to 28, and the Crusades from 1095 to 1291. He agrees that the taking away of the daily in 1131 refers to the same event as the taking away of the daily in chapter 8:11, and we'll come back to that. But the taking away of the daily and the setting up of the abomination of desolation took place, according to our understanding, in AD 508. That is 600 years before the Crusades in chapter 11, verses 25 to 28. So he has the Crusades from 25 to 28, the first period of the Crusade, but then the events in verse 31 go back to 508. So he has here, not straightforward, but he goes to 12th century or 13th century, and then he has to go back to the 6th century. So it isn't straightforward, as he said. Now I pointed this out to him in our discussion. And in response, he said that the principle of recapitulation allows him to do that. Now there is a principle of recapitulation, but you cannot apply it in Daniel 11 in this way. You see, the recapitulation principle means that several prophecies cover the same ground, but from different perspectives, as we have just seen. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, from Babylon to the second coming. They cover the same ground, but from different perspectives. Daniel 8, from Medo-Persia to the second coming. Again, the same ground. This is what we mean by recapitulation. Each chapter recapitulates what happened before, but it shows it from a different angle, from a different perspective. The same you have in Revelation 1 to 11. In the first 3 chapters, you have the 7 churches that go from the 1st century to the second coming, with Laodicea. In Revelation 6, you have the 7 seals. Again, they go from the 1st century to the second coming. Revelation 8 to 11, the 7 trumpets go from the 1st century to the second coming. This is what we mean by recapitulation. These chapters recapitulate what has been shown before in other chapters. But you cannot have recapitulation in the chapter itself. Go back and forth. That is not recapitulation, because you're not covering the same thing. You're doing something completely different. You follow me? So recapitulation cannot be used in Daniel 11 because it does not mean that you can jump, as far as time is concerned, from the 12th century back to the 6th century and then back to the 12th century or even the 15th century. So it does not work. The difficulty of correctly interpreting Daniel 11 is shown by the fact that Bible-believing historicists, and I mean Adventists here, have come to completely different interpretations. For example, among Adventists we find the following interpretations concerning the verses 23 to 30. Now, up to 22, we are basically united because there you have the cross, as I will point out in a minute. But 23 to 30 is a difficult portion of the chapter. And here you have the first interpretation says, the Roman history from the League of Friendship between the Romans and the Jews in 161 BC to Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. Now this is the view of Uriah Smith, George McCready Price, and a more recent book by Swearing, which was also, no, it wasn't published by Review, it was published by another Adventist publisher. The second view has the history of Antiochus Epiphanes throughout that period. This is the view of Desmond Ford and one of the teachers I had to deal with at the Romanian seminary in Chenica. A third view has the Roman history following the crucifixion in AD 31 until Emperor Constantine. This was the view of Haskell. The fourth view is the Wars of the Crusades, Shea and Rosenberg. And then another view, the spread of Christianity after the crucifixion, by a brother Nelson, who also wrote on this chapter. So please note, it is not the exegesis of the text that provides these different interpretations. Rather, the interpreters try to fit the text into some kind of historical event they believe has taken place and is reflected in these texts. The fact is that the text can somehow be made to fit these various ideas, should provide a caution for all of us not to be dogmatic on this issue. What happened in these texts? What is really the interpretation? Now, I don't believe that you have multiple interpretations. I believe there is one interpretation. The question is, which one is the right one? That is the issue, you see. I don't think you can have a different a smorgasbord of interpretations and you just pick one that you like. No. The question is, which one is the right one? Now, Rosenberg insists that Daniel is literal, geopolitical from the beginning, and so he said, I would expect it to stay that way to the end. In other words, we begin political and geographical, and then we go through to the end in the same way. Well, he himself doesn't do it, as I will point out in a minute. And there's another reason you can't do that, and that is that the death of Jesus, that the cross of Jesus changes things.
Amen.
So he denies that with the death of Jesus, the prophetic elements change. For example, in the New Testament, the land of Canaan becomes the heavenly Canaan. Jerusalem becomes the heavenly Jerusalem. The temple becomes a spiritual temple, the church. Israel becomes spiritual Israel. So you cannot simply take what you have in the first half of the book, or the chapter, and simply use the same things throughout. And he himself doesn't do that either, in spite of what he had just said. In verse 22, in Daniel 11, after the death of Jesus in verse 22, the literal geopolitical elements also change. The king of the north, who was, in the first part of the chapter, the Seleucids, the king of the north becomes a spiritual power, the papacy. The king of the south also becomes a spiritual or ideological entity. In the first half, it was the Ptolemies in Egypt. The beautiful land in verse 41 is no longer Israel, but the church. So you have to remember that after the cross, we are no longer in a literal geopolitical entity, but we are now moving into a spiritual entity. Now, Tim also changes, even though he says he wants to keep that, because for him the king of the north and the king of the south are the papacy and Islam. Whereas at the beginning, he correctly identifies king of the north and king of the south as the Ptolemies, or the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. So he himself also changes, even though he says we want to keep it throughout. Now, Rosenberg considers Daniel 11, 40 to 45 as the third war between Christianity and Islam in the future. Time will tell if this is correct. We don't know yet. We have to see. Rosenberg's book on Daniel 11 is an interesting interpretation of one of the most difficult chapters in the Bible, but it is by no means as solid exegetically as he believes. It seems to be another attempt to interpret Scripture with current events. I look at what is happening in the world, and then see if you can find a biblical text to fit. You know, we have had experience in this as a church. When we go back to Uriah Smith, in the beginning of our church, when it came to chapter 11, James White believed that the king of the north was the papacy. Along came Uriah Smith with his book on Daniel Revelation, and he changed the order because he looked at the events at his time, which was Turkey was the major player at that time, and the wars with Turkey. And so he identified the king of the north with Turkey, and the king of the south with Egypt, because at that time, in the 19th century, Egypt was still a player, a political player on the political scene. And so he had these two, Turkey and Egypt, and he added, for good measure, France as the king in verse 36, and then also in verse 40, because if you look at Daniel chapter 11, and in verse 40, where for the first time we have again king of the north and king of the south since the beginning or the early part of the chapter. In verse 40 it says, at that time, or at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. Now Uriah Smith interpreted the him as France. And then continues, and the king of the north shall come against him, also against France. Rather than the two fighting with each other, as Tim sees that, Uriah Smith had three powers in this text. Because in verse 36 he began, then the king shall do according to his own will, and there Uriah Smith saw the power of France, Napoleon, and the wars between Turkey and the rest of the world. So here you have a different interpretation, which became standard interpretation in Adventism. And during the First World War, when Turkey was called the sick man of the East, sick man in Europe, Adventists expected the second coming. Because they looked at chapter 11, they looked at Uriah Smith's book, and they saw there is this war that he has predicted, and they expected the second coming during the First World War. Well, as we all know, this was 100 years ago. Nothing happened. And the interpretation of Uriah Smith has in the meantime been changed. No Adventist interpreter holds this view today, as far as I know. There may be some. It's also interesting when you look at Islam. Ellen White never mentions Islam in connection with end-time events. Nor is Islam mentioned in the great prophecies of Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8. So this progression that we have seen, that these chapters all recapitulate what happened before, is now changed in Daniel 11, because all of a sudden we have a completely different picture with Islam. So much to the book. Now let me take you on a journey through Daniel 11. The understanding of Daniel 11, as I see it, and many Adventists see it, the last vision in the book of Daniel has three sections. First, the prologue in chapter 10. We're not going to deal with that because we don't have the time. And then the vision proper, which goes from chapter 11 to chapter 12, verse 4. And then we have the epilogue in chapter 12, 5 to 13, that concludes the chapter and the whole book. Modern critical scholarship interprets this chapter as a description of the wars between the Seleucids, that's the king of the north, and the Ptolemies, the king of the south, which was Egypt at the time. And they see this war culminating in the career of Antiochus Epiphanes, who was one of the Seleucid kings He was, I believe, number 8, and then there were another 20 kings in the Seleucid line after him. But he is famous because he persecuted the Jews. And he desecrated the temple and slaughtered a pig and sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple. So he desecrated the temple. And the Jews rose up against him, what we call the Maccabean Wars, and finally succeeded against him and established their own Maccabean or Hasmonean kingdom, which lasted for about 100 years until then the Romans came and took it over. So modern critical scholarship, by and large, accept this history of Antiochus Epiphanes and see this in chapter 11. Evangelical interpreters, so critical scholarship, Antiochus Epiphanes from 21 to 45. Evangelical scholarship goes along with this interpretation of the liberals, but in verse 34 they see Antiochus as prefiguring the Antichrist. And other scholars see a change, and from 36 to 45 they see only the Antichrist. But this is evangelical scholarship. Now, historicists in the past and Adventists today, and we are the only historicists left by and large, there are some smaller ones, but we are the largest church that still holds on to the historicist view of interpretation, as the Reformers and all the scholars up to the 19th century did. We do not go along with this interpretation, and as you have seen, among Adventists there are many different interpretations as far as Daniel 11 is concerned. Now, rather than trying to decide which of the interpretations I showed you is the correct one, I will focus on those points in the chapter that are clear and straightforward and can be supported by the principle Scripture interprets Scripture, one passage being the key to the other passages. We're going to use that to look at Daniel 11. I believe there are 5 points in chapter 11 that are clear and can be substantiated by comparing it with other texts in the prophecies. Okay? So the first point is the kings of Persia and Greece. In Daniel 11, verses 2 to 4, it says, "And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up, and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion, with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted even for others besides these." Now, at the time of the vision of Daniel, Cyrus, the Persian king who conquered Babylon, was ruling. And then it says, "Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all." So you have Cyrus, then you've got 3 more, Cambyses, Gamata, or the false Smerdis as he also called, and then Darius. And the 4th one is Xerxes. Now Xerxes, you may remember, was the husband of Esther. In the story of Esther, Ahasuerus is Xerxes, the king. When his fleet was destroyed at Salamis in 480 BC, and the next year he suffered a defeat on land in Plataea, the Persians stopped trying to conquer Greece. They gave up and went back home, and never again tried to conquer Europe or Greece. 150 years later, however, Alexander the Great conquered Persia instead. The Persians tried to conquer Greece. They were unsuccessful. But Alexander the Great was successful in conquering Persia and far beyond. He went all the way to India. Then his soldiers rebelled because they were tired of war, and so he had to go back. And he died in Babylon, it says of malaria or too much alcohol. Anyway, he died very young. And what happened to his kingdom? It was a large one. It was divided up. It was divided up. You see Alexander the Great in Daniel 8, the horn, and then 4 horns divided up his kingdom, as we know from Daniel 7 and 8. This is supported, or this view is also supported by Daniel 8, where we said Alexander is the large horn. And the 4 horns symbolize the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged out of the Alexandrian kingdom. So after Alexander, the 4 horns, they divided up the kingdom. Ptolemies took Egypt, Seleucus took the east, Lysimachus took part of what is Turkey, and the other part is what is today Bulgaria and Romania, and Cassander took Greece. These were the 4 kingdoms. Now, soon after the division, they fought amongst themselves, and eventually only 2 really survived. That is the Seleucid Empire in the north and the Egyptian Empire in the south. And in Daniel 11, in the first 15 chapters or so, you have the king of the north, Seleucid Empire, king of the south, the Egyptian Empire. These 2 kings, north and south, are not mentioned again until the end of the chapter in verse 40. But they remained in power until the Romans took over the territory in the 2nd century BC, or in the first and 2nd century BC. So at the beginning, this is clear. You can build on it that this is a correct interpretation. And everybody agrees, basically, because the history is clear on that. Now, the second clear point for me is the Messiah. In Daniel 11, 20 to 22, it says, "There shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but